which President Biden was due to attend or participate in. There was going to be a NATO meeting, there was going to be a European Council meeting, and there was going to be a G7 meeting. And there was wide expectations that new sanctions against Russia would be announced, that there was some talk that there might be more Russian banks removed from the interbank messaging system, that there was even some talk of a ban on Russian imports of oil and even of natural gas. And also there were all kinds of rumors about military action, military aid to Ukraine by the NATO powers, with some talk still of peacekeeping forces being sent to Western Ukraine, and even at the far edge of the, if you like, hyperbolic of no-fly zones and all the rest. And of course, on top of that, there was also expectations, widespread expectations, that a resounding statement would be published at one or all of these meetings, criticizing China's stance, criticizing the stance that China was taking in maintaining a neutrality in this conflict, a neutrality which actually, of course, favors Russia. Well, none of that happened. There was a statement about China, but it was very pallid. No substantive new sanctions were announced, certainly none of the sort that had been trailed, and there's no indication that there would be a military intervention by NATO or anybody who is a member of the NATO alliance in Ukraine either. President Zelensky, for what it's worth, has said that he is disappointed by the outcome of the NATO summit meeting. So it was already perhaps a somewhat, shall we say, unimpressive visit by President Biden to Europe, but it was all supposed to culminate in a speech, this speech in Poland, in which it was widely expected that he would rally the Western world, perhaps rally the entire world against Russian aggression, as he describes it, against Ukraine. Well, what I will say is, and I don't think what I'm going to say is at all controversial, he botched it. This was his moment to be like JFK, John Kennedy, when he went to Berlin shortly after the Berlin Wall was put up. He made that famous speech in which he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," a phrase, by the way, which provoked some amusement in Germany, because it didn't mean exactly, I think, what President Kennedy thought it meant, but still it was a resounding speech. It was a speech in which President Kennedy did once more give assurance to the German people, to the people of Berlin, to the people of the West, of US leadership. And of course, perhaps less famous, but also fairly famous, there was another speech that Ronald Reagan once gave in Berlin when he called on Mr. Gorbachev to take down this wall. He meant, of course, the Berlin Wall. So that was perhaps the standard that we were led to expect that President Biden would try to reach, rhetorical standard that he would try to reach, and he would make a speech similarly resounding to those speeches by JFK all those years ago, back in 1961, and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And I should say that the speech was heavily trailed. I obviously keep a close watch on these things. I follow the news closely. There's lots of indications from the administration that this was going to be a major speech, and it was going to be a speech that would resound around the world. Well, the speech came, and I'm going to say straight away that it was a mess. And not just a mess in terms of its final words, the words in which President Biden, called for regime change in Russia and the overthrow of President Putin, But the entire speech, in my opinion, was a mess. And I should say, first of all, and I do want to address this point about those final words, the call for President Putin's overthrow, because, of course, almost immediately, almost as soon as the president said those words, officials in the administration were trying to walk them back, and we've now had a mumbled explanation from Secretary Blinken that President Biden didn't mean what he said. Well, I'm providing with this video a link to this speech, and you will see that the idea that those words at the end of the speech, the words calling for President Putin's overthrow, were an afterthought, a gaffe, which President Biden stumbled into, that is simply not true. The entire speech is constructed to lead up to the point where President Biden would make this call for President Putin's overthrow. It is in fact the logical end point of the entire speech. Clearly it was written in advance. Clearly that phrase was there. It's not a gaffe. It's not something that President Biden came up with impromptu and threw in at the last moment. It was, as I said, the logical outcome of this speech. It's clear that President Biden and his speechwriters, it's not clear who these people were, didn't think through the implications, didn't realize what the effect of those words would be. And I would say that those words came after a whole series of verbal missteps by the president, not in this particular speech, where he said lots of things which I think a European audience especially would be deeply alarmed by, but I will come to that in a moment. But he also said all sorts of other things that I think were alarming, especially to a European audience, but I suspect even to some people in the United States over the course of this visit. Thus, he said that if the Russians resorted to chemical weapons during the war in Ukraine, the United States would respond in kind, which appeared to suggest that the United States would, at that point, start acting like it was using chemical weapons itself. This was, again, rowed back. There were suggestions that what the president meant is that the US would react proportionately, but that's not what he said. And of course, it's not entirely clear what exactly he did mean. But for what it's worth, I think that the words the president used, that the United States would act in kind, were meant to be threatening to the Russians. And then, of course, he made a further series of comments when he addressed the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division. He gave the impression that they might indeed actually have to go into Ukraine and join the conflict there. Again, we were told that this was not the intention and that these words were somehow impromptu words, possibly a gaffe. My own view of all of these words is that they reflect the extreme belligerence that this president has brought to this conflict and his overstated, overheated language about President Putin, which has been building up now for some time. Of course, last year, a few months after he became president, he agreed with a journalist that President Putin was a killer, already an unwise thing to say. And over the last couple of days and weeks, he's called President Putin a war criminal, a dictator, all sorts of things like this. So, in my opinion, all of this rhetoric, the rhetoric culminating in the demand for President Putin's overthrow and all this threatening language about chemical weapons and addressed to the 82nd Airborne Division, are clear reflections of President Biden's sentiments. And if we come to the actual speech itself, we see further examples of this. Firstly, President Biden appeared to say that the war would go on and go on for a very long time. He didn't seem to show any interest or concern about finding some way to bring the war to an end. He showed no indication that he was aiming for any kind of diplomatic settlement. He spoke gloatingly about the problems of the Russian economy, about the fact that the ruble had fallen to 200 rubles to the dollar, something, by the way, which at the moment is certainly not true. But anyway, again, the impression given is that that was what he wanted to see. He wanted to see severe hardship amongst the Russian people, suggesting that he wants to maintain the sanctions regime that's been imposed in place pretty much indefinitely. He went out of his way repeatedly to refer to earlier acts by the Soviet Union, the suppression of the Hungarian revolt in 1956, the intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968, the interventions in Afghanistan, all those sort of things, in a way that appeared to conflate contemporary Russia, today's Russia, with the Soviet Union, giving a strong impression that as far as President Biden is concerned, this is a continuation of a long, almost existential conflict with the Russians, who he clearly sees as some sort of permanent enemy, almost irrespective of whatever happens, either in Russia or the world. And of course, he also reminisced about his meeting in Leningrad in 1972 with the then Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, in a way that I suppose was intended to show President Biden's vast experience of foreign policy, but which again gave the impression that he was living very much in the past, in the Cold War, as all his various observations and comments about the Soviet Union and its past conduct must also have suggested. So, unsurprisingly, the Europeans, seeing all of this and becoming increasingly concerned about the way in which the sanctions war is starting to backfire on themselves, are becoming concerned. And we've had criticisms from President Macron. We've even had criticisms now from the British government, with Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, who has been at the absolute forefront of talking up the challenge from Russia, even now floating the possibility of sanctions on Russia being lifted if the conflict in Ukraine is settled. And of course, we've also had comments from other countries, from Germany, from a German diplomat, Ischinger, former diplomat, also saying that these comments were inappropriate. And in fact, as I am making this program, this backlash against President Biden's comments is intensifying. And I think the reason it is intensifying is because, despite all the attempts to walk back these comments by Secretary Blinken, by other US officials, there is, I think, a growing realization, not just in the United States, but also in European capitals and around the world, that when President Biden indicates that he wants to see the overthrow of President Putin, he means what he says, and that this has been the plan all along. At the time when those sanctions against the Russian central bank were imposed, we said on the DURAN, Alex Christoforou and I, that the clear agenda here was regime change in Moscow. Now, the European leaders, who I suspect are becoming increasingly alarmed at the way the sanctions war has degenerated into an economic war of attrition, are becoming increasingly concerned that the rhetoric that President Biden is using suggests that this economic war of attrition is going to go on indefinitely. And of course, this is coming at a time when they're especially nervous, with the Russians floating this idea about only selling oil and gas for rubles. And the Europeans don't know quite what that means. And I think they're extremely nervous that it means that Russian oil and gas flows to Europe are about to stop at a time when Europe remains completely dependent or massively dependent on Russian oil and gas, and at a time when European leaders are starting to realize the enormous economic costs for them, for their societies, for their economies, for their people, of this economic war of attrition against the Russians that they have blundered into. So I think that these words of President Biden have been met with great dismay in Europe, especially, and I think that it's perhaps the moment when European leaders have finally grasped a point which we have been making on the DURAN and here on this channel for some time, that this is a runaway train upon which all of these European leaders, perhaps without understanding fully what they were doing, clambered onto. And now they sense that the driver of this train, the President of the United States, is utterly fixated with President Putin to the point where he is prepared to drive the train off the cliff. So whether that was the intention or not, that's the kind of backlash that we are now seeing. Well, I don't know how one can correct this, and I have to say, I don't think there's any possibility, frankly, of it being corrected. I think the Europeans perhaps are starting to realize the extent of their own folly in allowing the United States, and to a lesser degree Britain, to determine their diplomatic approaches in the run-up to the war, to refute any discussion on the eastward expansion of NATO, to insist that NATO's fictional open door would stay indefinitely open to countries like Ukraine, to refuse outright Russian requests for security guarantees. I don't think that they expected that the outcome would be as it was, and I don't think they expected that they would be involved in what is looking increasingly like an indefinite economic war of attrition, which will leave them all much poorer. And I don't think also that they realized that what they were letting themselves in for was a plan by the administration, by the neocons there, for regime change in Moscow, something which I think the Europeans realize is not on the agenda. So there we are. I don't know what the Europeans do in this case. They've been publishing all sorts of coded criticisms of President Biden's speech, but I don't really see how they can get off this runaway train. I also have to say as well that I don't think that the Russians, if the Europeans were to try to get off this runaway train, I don't think that the Russians would be particularly impressed or would necessarily believe them. I think after what has happened, after the diplomatic catastrophe of the last few months, I think the Russians have probably made a strategic decision that they're going to reorient all their oil and energy and food and raw materials exports eastwards to China and India and the countries of Asia, and that they're going to start winding down their economic connections to Europe, and that this is a decision that they're going to make or have probably already made, because, to be said straightforwardly, I don't think they trust the Europeans anymore. So I think that the Europeans with the speech by President Biden, perhaps have finally understood the recklessness of their own actions and the extent to which policy which is being made in the White House is pursuing an agenda that they were never really signed up to. But I don't think that they're going to be in any kind of position to get off, to change or slow down this process, because I doubt that the Russians either. I don't think that the Russians either would be prepared to take things back to where they were. So that's my own view about President Biden's speech. I suspect that underpinning European concerns is also a gradual realization of the state of events in Ukraine. I gather that the British Defence Ministry, based on British intelligence, has now finally acknowledged and has advised ministers and the media here in Britain that the Russian objective is the destruction of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine. And I think that this is now starting to be understood across European capitals, and I think that they've gradually come to understand that the war is being fought differently from the way they imagined, and that the outcome of that war will, shall we say, not be to their advantage. But that is a topic for my next video, when I will return to a discussion of the situation in Ukraine itself. Until then, let us all perhaps reflect on this moment of President Biden's speech. Let's actually, in my opinion, be grateful to him for providing clarity about what I think have been the administration's intentions all along. Perhaps the Europeans are shocked and dismayed. Perhaps some people in Washington are. I, speaking for myself, am not surprised at all. And I think, and I'm not the only person to say this, I think that this has been the agenda: regime change in Moscow.